Roanoke, the Lost Colony, an unsolved mystery from history. When I grow up, I want to be a detective just like my dad. He says I was born curious, and curiosity is the best tool a detective can have. Right now, I'm curious about old mysteries that have never been solved. In police terms, these cases are called open, but Dad and I call them unsolved mysteries from history, and I am determined to figure out at least one of them. For each mystery I collect as much about the case as I can. As I go along, I organize the clues in my notebook. Sometimes I use timelines, and I always keep a list of words that are important to the case. Roanoke, the Lost Colony, is about a group of English people who came to the American continent in the 1500s to begin a new settlement. They all disappeared. Though lots of people have ideas or theories about what might have happened, no one is sure. My dad says no mystery is impossible to solve as long as you have enough clues. This is how the story goes. The word Roanoke comes from the Roanoke people, an Algonquin tribe that lived in the area. However, the European settlers who felt they had discovered the New World, which consisted of North and South America, also believed they were the land's rightful owners. Without regard for the natives' rights to the land, they considered it part of Virginia and claimed it for their own. Today, that piece of coastline is part of North Carolina. John White's drawings recorded everything he saw in the New World. White was not a great artist. In one of his paintings, a native woman even had 2 right feet. His work was to serve science, not art. Only some of John White's paintings survived, about 75 originals. John White was a loyal Englishman and an artist. He was chosen to lead the colony by Sir Walter Raleigh, who had been given the charter to the land in Roanoke by the Queen. White may not have had leadership skills, but he had already been to the New World. He had brought back paintings of the new plants, animals, people. The colonists were chosen by Raleigh and White to build the new community. There were more than 60 men, farmers, craftsmen, assistants. There were close to 20 women, including White's own pregnant daughter, to work in the fields and houses. There were almost a dozen children. The word Indian was used for the native people of the New World because Christopher Columbus, landing in the Bahamas in 1492, thought he was in India. When the colonists landed on Roanoke Island, they referred to the native people as savages because they did not understand their customs, manner of dress, or culture. Today, Native American, Native people, and Indian are all acceptable, though the native peoples themselves prefer to be known by their individual tribal names. 2 native men were also part of White's group. One of them, Manteo, had traveled in the company of the English before. John White hoped they would help the colonists with the local native people. He knew that the earlier colonists had had problems with fights, with diseases, with killings, though he had never told Raleigh. He was sure that with the soldiers already at the fort and with Manteo to help, he could keep his colonists safe. On ocean journeys, several types of ships were generally used, including flagship, the fleet's largest, best, or safest ship, on which the commander sailed. The flyboat, a large boat with 1 or 2 masts, generally square-rigged. The pinnace, a smaller, faster, more maneuverable boat that sometimes carried oars. Colonists left Portsmouth on April 26, 1587. They planned to meet with the soldiers, then go to Chesapeake Bay, north of Roanoke, where the land was more fertile and the harbor was safer. They sailed in 3 boats, a flyboat, a pinnace, and the flagship Lion. After a month and a half at sea, they reached the Americas at last, stopping first on several islands. At Santa Cruz, several colonists ate green fruit. Their lips and tongues swelled badly. A number of people drank from a pond that had water so evil they fell dreadfully ill. Some who washed their faces in the water had swollen eyes for 5 or 6 days after. They captured 5 huge tortoises for meat, so large 16 men became exhausted hauling them back to the ship. At last, the flagship dropped anchor outside Roanoke's shallow harbor. White and 40 of his men planned to take the pinnace to shore to meet with the soldiers, then continue on to Chesapeake where they were going to stay. But the ship's pilot, Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. He refused to take the colonists any farther and put them all ashore at Roanoke. When White and his men got to the fort ahead of the larger group of colonists, they found it razed. Razed means destroyed completely by having been torn down. Great melon vines grew in what remained of the houses. Deer grazed there. All that was left of the soldiers was a single skeleton. "We must make the best of what we have," said White. So they began to repair the houses. The coastline that the colonists sailed along is made up of dangerous inlets and coves. A ship coming upon the shore first encounters barrier islands parallel to the coastline, then the mainland itself. At the bottom of these waters, sometimes called the graveyard of the Atlantic, hundreds of ships and boats lie wrecked. While work continued on the buildings, one man, George Howe, went fishing alone. Stripping off his clothes, he waded into the shallow water, trying to catch crabs with a small forked stick. When he did not return, the others searched for him. They found him dead, riddled with arrows. The colonists suspected Indians had killed him. White sent Manteo and 20 men to Croatoan Island, where the nearest native people lived. They approached the villain with drawn muskets, which frightened the peaceful Croatoans, until they saw Manteo, who translated their story. 4 soldiers were in a boat fishing. 30 of our enemies from several other tribes surrounded the soldiers at the fort. Men on both sides were killed. The soldiers who were not hurt ran to the boat and rowed away. We never saw them again. George Howe was killed by the same people. The Croatoans then pleaded for a token by which the English would know them as friends. No token was given. Later that week, the English mounted a surprise attack in the middle of the night on the people they thought had killed Howe. Spying a campfire, they shot one man and chased the others through the reeds, including women and children. But the colonists had made a terrible mistake. These were the friendly Croatoans, who, knowing their enemies had left the area, had come to gather up peas, corn, pumpkin, tobacco. As a reward for faithful service, the English christened Manteo a few days later, calling him Lord of Roanoke and Dasamankapuk. They thought that this would make him a better friend to the English and a loyal subject of Queen Elizabeth. What Manteo thought of the ceremony is unknown. On August 18th, White's daughter Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America. This was cause for great celebration. But summer was drawing to a close, and the colonists started to worry. They were quickly running out of supplies. No one knew they were on Roanoke Island. They were supposed to be in Chesapeake, 50 miles to the north. Should they move there? Should they send someone back to England to let Raleigh know of their plight? White was pressured to go. He hated leaving his daughter and new grandchild, but the colonists were convinced he was the best man for the job. So he buried his notebooks, drawings, map, and armor, and worked out a special code with the colonists. If you leave, carve your destination on a tree. Put a cross if there has been trouble. 9 days later, on August 27th, White set sail for England. White left Roanoke in a storm, an awful crossing, desperate to get to England, desperate to round up supplies, desperate to return quickly to Roanoke Colony. But politics, war, and the Spanish Armada all conspired to keep him in England. There was nothing he could do. Half a year later in the spring, White tried to sail with 2 small ships filled with sailors, 15 new colonists, and supplies. But the sailors insisted on privateering along the way. They attacked not only Spanish ships, but a Scottish boat and a French ship as well. White was wounded twice in hand-to-hand combat. All of the colonists' supplies were stolen. They limped back to England. It was March 20th, 1590, before Raleigh could gather enough money to send any other ships. 5 months later, having survived storms and more fights, the ships anchored at the tip of Croatoan Island. Finally, they moved on to the outer islands. Even though it was evening, White and his men could see smoke rising from the vicinity of the Roanoke fort. In the morning, they tried to row ashore in 2 small boats through terrible waves. 1 boat capsized. 7 men drowned. Anchoring in the shallow harbor that night, they tried to alert the colonists by sounding a trumpet, by singing English folk songs loudly, by calling out to the people on shore. There was no answer. In the morning, they went to the fort. It was completely empty. Carved into a tree near the village were the letters C-R-O. On one side of the palisade post was the word Croatoan. There was no cross indicating any trouble. All that they found inside the fort were bars of iron, pigs of lead, iron shot. Once buried chests lay overturned, ransacked, including White's own possessions. The pinnace used by the colonists was gone. Weeds grew everywhere. John White returned to England due to storms, politics, money, history. He never set foot in the New World again, but other explorers did. John Smith, friend of Pocahontas, heard from 2 Indian tribes that clothed men still lived in the area. Later, Pocahontas' father admitted being part of an attack on the colonists. Smith did not speak of this until 14 years after returning to England. Another explorer, William Strachey, heard rumors in 1610 of Indians whose slaves built them stone-walled houses. Others heard stories of blonde, blue-eyed natives, yet no such clothed men, slaves, or blonde natives were ever found. Centuries later, the Lumbee of North Carolina claimed their ancestors were both Indian and English. In 1998, archaeologists discovered an English signet ring on a dig in nearby Hatteras Island. Could it have belonged to one of the lost colonists? No one can really be sure. So what really happened? According to my dad, no one knows for sure. But now you have the whole story. You have studied my notes, the timeline, and the word list. Perhaps you can solve the mystery of the Roanoke colony. Maybe you'll believe one of the old theories of what happened, or maybe you'll come up with a theory of your own. Only remember, as my dad always says, check your clues. Number 1, the no survivors theory. The colonists of Roanoke were killed by the local native people, bent on revenge, or by the Spanish explorers who also wanted to colonize the same area. Did either group have a reason for killing the colonists? Was there any evidence of murder? Was there any sign of distress such as an engraved cross? Number 2, absorbed by the native people theory. The colonists lived with the native people and eventually became part of the tribes by either marrying into the group or being captured as slaves. What would have made the colonists leave their homes? Was there any evidence of fighting? Did the native people keep slaves, and were any European slaves ever sighted or found? Do the Lumbee people claim to have European ancestors? The third theory, the lost at sea theory. The colonists tried to sail home to England and got lost at sea. Could the pinnace have carried 100 colonists? Could it have gotten through Spanish blockades or fought a major battle? Could it have survived major storms? Did the colonists leave clues as to where they were going? Did they bring their weapons and possessions? Are any of these theories right? Nobody knows for sure. Not the police, not the lawyers, not the reporters, not the historians, and not even my dad. It is a mystery still waiting to be solved. It is, as my dad says, an open file. But I've got my own theory about what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. And maybe now you do too.